The Stork Club, East 53rd Street, Manhattan. February 18, 1946, 11:37 p.m. The most exclusive nightclub in New York City, where Frank Sinatra crooned for millionaires and J. Edgar Hoover nursed martinis in dark corners. Where the velvet rope separated the powerful from the powerless. Where deals worth more than most men would earn in a lifetime were sealed over champagne and Cuban tobacco. When Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson walked through the door of the VIP lounge, 6 men were waiting for him around a polished mahogany table. Cuban cigar smoke hung beneath Art Deco lamps like morning fog over a graveyard. Fine crystal reflected the shadows of New York's most dangerous faces, men whose names appeared in FBI files thick as phone books. And sitting at the center of that deadly circle, hands clasped on the table like an emperor on his throne, was Lucky Luciano, the man who had unified the Italian Mafia into a crime corporation, the architect of modern organized crime, the gangster who had turned chaos into order and blood into business. Bumpy walked slowly, his shoes echoing against the black and white marble like the ticking of a bomb. He wore a navy blue 3-piece suit, white shirt with no tie. He never wore ties. A gold watch chain hung from his vest pocket. In his right hand, he carried a worn leather briefcase. Luciano's bodyguards rose to their feet. 3 massive men, former Brooklyn dock workers who had killed for less than a wrong look. Their hands slid toward pistols hidden beneath their jackets. The hammers clicked. That metallic sound filled the silence like a snake's hiss before it strikes. But Bumpy didn't stop, didn't raise his hands, didn't step back even an inch. He just kept walking, his eyes locked on Luciano, ignoring the guns pointed at his chest like they were children's toys. And then something happened that no one in that room would ever forget. Lucky Luciano raised a single finger, an almost imperceptible gesture, but absolute. The bodyguards lowered their weapons. Frank Costello, seated to Luciano's right, released a held breath. Albert Anastasia, the Lord High Executioner, the man who had ordered more murders than there are days in a year, clenched his jaw and sat back down. And Bumpy Johnson, without saying a word, pulled out the chair at the head of the table, the chair that was always reserved for the boss, and sat down. He placed his briefcase on the table, pulled out a cigar, lit it with the calm of a man who just arrived at his own house. Because what was about to happen in that room wasn't an ordinary negotiation. It was the moment when the king of Harlem would teach the architect of the modern mafia something no other man had dared to teach him. That power isn't always won with bullets. To understand what happened that night at the Stork Club, you first have to understand who Bumpy Johnson really was. He wasn't just another gangster in New York's underworld. He was the man who had turned Harlem into an impregnable kingdom. A strategist who thought 5 moves ahead of his enemies. A chess player in a world of street brawlers. Born in South Carolina in 1905, Ellsworth Raymond Johnson arrived in Harlem as a teenager, with his back covered in scars from cotton-field overseers and his fists ready to fight anyone who tried to put him back in chains. The Great Migration had brought thousands of black families from the South toward the promises of the industrial North, toward factory jobs and freedom, toward a life that didn't involve bowing your head to white men who thought they owned you. But what they found wasn't freedom, just a different kind of chains. Segregation, poverty, violence. Police who'd crack your skull for looking at them wrong. Landlords who'd charge you double because of your skin color. Jobs that paid half what white workers earned. Harlem was a gilded ghetto where jazz clubs shone like beacons amid broken streets, where Duke Ellington's orchestra played for crowds in tuxedos while children went hungry 3 blocks away. And on those broken streets, Bumpy learned the only lesson that mattered. If you wanted to survive, you had to be smarter than everyone else. Not stronger, not meaner, smarter. By 20, he was the right hand of Stephanie St. Clair, the queen of policy, the black French woman who controlled Harlem's largest numbers racket and who saw something in that quiet young man that other people missed. Bumpy wasn't just muscle. He was brains. He studied patterns like a mathematician, memorized police routes like a general studying battlefield maps, identified weaknesses in rival organizations with the precision of a surgeon finding cancer. And when Dutch Schultz, the violent psychopath who controlled the Bronx, tried to invade Harlem in 1935, it was Bumpy who orchestrated the resistance. Not with open war, with intelligence. Schultz had made the classic mistake of powerful men. He believed violence was enough. He sent his gunmen to extort Harlem's numbers runners, to burn businesses, to beat old women in the street to send a message. But Harlem didn't bend, because Bumpy had done something Schultz could never understand. He had earned the community's respect. When widows' children needed shoes for school, Bumpy paid. When an honest business was about to close from debt, Bumpy gave the money. When police arrested an innocent young man just for being black, Bumpy hired the best lawyer in Manhattan. He wasn't Robin Hood. He was smarter than that. He was a man who understood that true power doesn't come from fear, but from loyalty. And so, when Schultz thought he could take Harlem by force, he found that nobody would sell him information. Nobody would rat out Bumpy's runners. Nobody cooperated. Schultz died in a bloodbath in October 1935, murdered in a New Jersey tavern. Officially, it was the Mafia Commission who ordered his death because he wanted to kill prosecutor Thomas Dewey. But everyone in the underworld knew the truth. Schultz had died because he underestimated the quiet man from Harlem, who never raised his voice, but always won the game. 11 years later, in February 1946, Lucky Luciano wanted what Schultz couldn't take. Harlem's numbers racket generated millions of dollars weekly. It was the most consistent money machine in New York organized crime. And Luciano, the genius who had modernized the mob, who had replaced Sicilian vendettas with corporate boards, who had turned crime into business, knew he needed that river of cash before being deported to Italy forever. But he also knew something else. He knew Bumpy Johnson wasn't Dutch Schultz. You couldn't intimidate him. You couldn't buy him. You couldn't kill him without starting a war that would set all of Harlem ablaze and attract federal attention. So Luciano did something unusual for a man of his position. He requested a meeting, showed respect, sent a formal invitation, and waited. Bumpy didn't respond for a full week. That silence was his first move, a message without words that said, "You don't come to my territory giving orders. You come to negotiate as equals, or you don't come at all." When he finally accepted, it was on his terms. No bodyguards, no visible weapons. Just a conversation between two men who controlled invisible empires. And that's how we arrived at that February night, at the Stork Club, in the smoke-filled room with dangerous men. At the moment when Bumpy Johnson walked toward pointed guns and didn't blink, Lucky Luciano watched Bumpy settle into his chair, light his cigar and exhale smoke toward the gold leaf ceiling. For 10 full seconds, no one spoke. The silence was so thick you could hear the distant clinking of champagne glasses in the club's main hall. Frank Costello, the man running the Luciano family's business while the boss was in prison, leaned forward with his elbows on the table. His pearl gray suit was perfectly pressed, his Italian silk tie knotted with millimeter precision. He was the mob's respectable face, the man who dined with senators and played golf with federal judges, but his gray eyes had the edge of a scalpel. Meyer Lansky, the genius accountant who had designed the mob's money laundering system, drummed his fingers on a glass of Scotch whiskey. He was short, thin, almost physically insignificant. But everyone at that table knew Lansky was the Syndicate's real treasure, the financial brain that turned blood into clean dollars. Albert Anastasia leaned against the back wall, arms crossed, his gaze fixed on Bumpy like a shark watching an open wound. Anastasia needed no introduction. He was death personified. The man who ran Murder Inc., the hitman division that executed contracts across the country. They say he'd lost count of how many men he'd personally killed after number 50. And the 3 bodyguards, though they'd already holstered their pistols, remained standing like statues of armed stone. Lucky Luciano finally broke the silence. His voice was soft, almost kind, with that Sicilian accent he'd never quite been able to shake. "Mr. Johnson, thank you for coming." Bumpy took a long drag on his cigar. "You wanted to talk. Don Luciano, so talk." There was no reverence in his tone, no submission, just the statement of a man who knew exactly his worth in that room. Luciano interlaced his fingers on the table, leaning slightly forward. "I'm leaving the country in less than 3 weeks. The government's deporting me to Italy. Not because I lost, but because that was the deal. I helped win the war, now they're sending me back home. But before I go, I need to make sure New York keeps running without me. The 5 families are in order. Costello handles my interests. Genovese waits his turn in Naples. Anastasia controls the docks. Everything's in place." He made a deliberate pause. "Except Harlem." Bumpy didn't react. His face could have been carved from granite. "The numbers racket," Luciano continued, "is generating more money than the docks, more than prostitution, more than most of our legitimate businesses. And you control it. You've got the people's trust. You've got the infrastructure. You've got the right cops on your payroll. I respect that." He raised a hand, as if blessing the conversation. "That's why I'm not here to take anything from you, Mr. Johnson. I'm here to offer you a partnership. You keep running Harlem like you always have. We provide political protection, investment capital when you need it, and connections that'll open doors you don't even know exist. In return, we take 40% of the net profits." Costello nodded as if the deal was so reasonable that rejecting it would be insane. Lansky drank his whiskey without taking his eyes off Bumpy. Anastasia didn't move. Bumpy let the silence stretch, counted to 20 in his head before speaking. "And what happens if I say no?" It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Luciano smiled, but his eyes went cold as black ice on a frozen lake. "Then we have a problem, Mr. Johnson. Because if you're not with us, you're against us, and nobody survives being against us." He didn't say it with anger, didn't say it with threat in his voice. He said it with the absolute certainty of a man who had built his empire on that exact philosophy. It was a law of nature. Opposing Lucky Luciano was like opposing gravity. The result was inevitable. Bumpy Johnson crushed his cigar in the crystal ashtray. The sound was like a soft gunshot amid the silence. He opened his leather briefcase. The bodyguards tensed. Anastasia took a step forward, but Bumpy simply pulled out an 8x10 black and white photograph. He slid it across the polished table like a card in a poker game. Luciano picked it up. His expression didn't change, but his fingers closed around the edges with enough force that the paper curved slightly. The photograph showed a warehouse in Red Hook, Brooklyn, one of Anastasia's gambling operations. And in front of that warehouse, shaking hands with a known police captain, was Albert Anastasia himself. The date printed in the lower corner read February 15th, 1946, 3 days earlier. "That photo was taken 72 hours ago," Bumpy said, in a voice so calm he could have been discussing the weather. "I've got 11 more exactly like it. Different warehouses, different cops, different members of your organization." Costello stopped breathing. Lansky set down his glass with exaggerated care. Anastasia took another step toward Bumpy, his hand moving toward the gun at his waist. But Lucky Luciano raised that hand again, a single finger in the air, and Anastasia froze. "You threatening me, Mr. Johnson?" Bumpy looked him straight in the eyes. "No, Don Luciano. I'm showing you respect, because I could have sent those photographs to the district attorney, could have sent them to the New York Times, could have burned your whole operation to the ground before you even knew I had them." He leaned forward. "But I didn't. Because you came to Harlem asking for a partnership, and a partnership means equals. What you just offered me isn't a partnership. It's a takeover with a smile." Lucky Luciano set the photograph down on the table like it was burning. His eyes, those eyes that had seen things that would make strong men lose sleep, locked on the image. For the first time since Bumpy entered the room, something like surprise crossed his face. It wasn't fear. Men like Luciano had stopped feeling fear decades ago, had burned it out of their system on the streets of 5 Points when he was 14 and had already killed his first man. It was something more dangerous. It was recognition. The same expression a chess master gets when he realizes his opponent just sacrificed a bishop to set up checkmate in 5 moves. When you understand you've been playing against someone who sees the board as clearly as you do. Luciano looked up from the photograph. In those seconds of silence, you could hear the collective heartbeat in that room. The ticking of the Swiss clock on the wall sounded like war drums. "So what is it you want, Mr. Johnson?" Bumpy pulled out another cigar. This time it was Anastasia who lit a match and offered it from across the table. A small but significant gesture. Bumpy accepted the flame, inhaled deeply, and blew the smoke to the side. "You want what Schultz wanted. What every Italian organization that's looked at Harlem for the last 20 years has wanted. Control. Power. A piece of New York's most efficient money machine. But there's a reason Schultz failed. A reason the Terranovas failed before him. A reason every attempt to take Harlem by force has ended in blood and losses." He pointed toward the window, toward the lights of Harlem glowing in the distance like terrestrial constellations. "Harlem doesn't run on fear. It runs on trust. My people give me their money not because I point a gun at them, but because they know when their number hits, I'm gonna pay them every last cent. Because they know when their children need food, I'll give them work. Because they know when the police harass them unfairly, I'll hire the best lawyer in Manhattan to defend them." He took another drag from his cigar before continuing. Schultz never understood that. He came to Harlem like all the rest, with guns, with threats, with the idea he could just take what he wanted. He thought black people were stupid, that we'd just bow down and say thank you while he robbed us. He sent his men to beat old women in the street, to burn businesses, to torture runners in front of their families. Thought muscle was enough. Bumpy's eyes darkened with the memory. But what Schultz didn't understand is that every time he hurt someone in Harlem, he made me stronger. Because I was the one who showed up the next day with money to rebuild. I was the one who paid for funerals. I was the one who sought revenge, not with blind violence, but with strategy. Schultz turned Harlem into my army without even realizing it. Frank Costello cleared his throat. "We're not Dutch Schultz." Bumpy nodded slowly. "I know. That's why I'm sitting here talking instead of sending those photos straight to the feds. You're smarter. You understand business is done better with handshakes than coffins. That's why I'm gonna make you an offer." Meyer Lansky stopped drumming his fingers. Luciano leaned back in his chair, waiting. "You asked for 40%, Bumpy said. "I'll give you 10. Absolute silence. 10% of net profits, not as protection money. As payment for services, you provide banking support. We need clean money to pay winners when heavy numbers hit. You provide legal help when our runners get arrested. In return, you get your 10% monthly. Clean, consistent, no risk." Anastasia let out a humorless laugh. 10%? You're offering us scraps." Bumpy looked at him directly. "I'm offering you a constant river of cash with zero exposure. No arrest risk. No need to manage operations in hostile territory. No war, no losses, just pure profit." Lansky spoke for the first time. His voice was soft, calculating. "That's an interesting proposition. No overhead, no infrastructure to maintain. Capital we can use for other investments." Costello rubbed his jaw. "And what stops us from just setting up the banking system and then cutting you out once we've got the structure in place?" Bumpy answered without blinking. "Same thing that stops you from trying to take Harlem by force. Mutually assured destruction. You betray me. Those photographs go public and you lose all your political protection. I betray you. You come after me with everything you've got. We both lose, or we both get rich. Your call." There was a moment of silence. Then Bumpy added one last condition. "And one more thing. You never, and I mean never, send your people to collect in Harlem. You want your money? You send a courier to my office. I'll have it counted, wrapped, and ready. But your soldiers don't patrol my streets. Your guns don't show up in my neighborhood. Your threats don't scare my people. Harlem stays black. Harlem stays mine. Those are my terms." Lucky Luciano looked at Meyer Lansky. The genius accountant nodded almost imperceptibly. Luciano looked at Frank Costello. The mob's diplomat shrugged with an expression that said, "We could do worse." Luciano even looked at Albert Anastasia. New York's most dangerous killer twisted his mouth into something that almost could have been a smile of respect. Then Lucky Luciano did something very few people had seen in his life. He laughed. It wasn't a mocking laugh. It wasn't a contemptuous laugh. It was a genuine belly laugh. The sound of a man who had just realized something fundamental about the universe. "You know what, Bumpy?" he said between laughs. "Schultz was an idiot. Should have talked to you first instead of sending his gunmen." He stood up, extended his hand across the table. 10%. Banking and legal support. No soldiers in Harlem. Monthly delivery. Bumpy rose, shook Luciano's hand. One firm grip, solid. The kind of handshake that seals deals lasting decades. "We have an agreement." Frank Costello exhaled deeply. Meyer Lansky smiled for the first time all night. Even Albert Anastasia relaxed, stepping back to his position against the wall. Luciano held Bumpy's hand an extra second. "Let me tell you something, Bumpy. I've done business with presidents, cops, union bosses, killers. I've negotiated with people who control entire countries. But you're the first man who came to my table and told me no without pulling a gun. That takes guts or stupidity. I still haven't decided which." Bumpy showed one of his rare, genuine smiles. "When you figure it out, let me know." Bumpy closed his briefcase, walked toward the door. The bodyguards stepped aside to let him pass, this time making no move toward their weapons. When he reached the threshold, he stopped and looked back. "One more thing, Don Luciano." "What's that, Bumpy?" "Don't point guns at me again. Next time I won't be so polite." And he was gone. 3 weeks later, Lucky Luciano boarded a ship bound for Italy. He would never set foot on American soil again. He'd spend the last 16 years of his life in Naples, running international operations, building connections with the Sicilian Mafia, finally dying of a heart attack in an airport in 1962 while waiting to meet with a Hollywood producer who wanted to make a movie about his life. But the deal he made with Bumpy Johnson that night at the Stork Club held for 22 years. Harlem's numbers racket flourished. Bumpy paid his 10% like a Swiss watch. Never a day late, never a dollar short. The Italians provided banking support through legitimate fronts, laundering lottery money through laundromats, restaurants, and import businesses. When Bumpy was arrested in 1951 and sent to Alcatraz on drug trafficking charges, Frank Costello personally made sure his family didn't go without. When Bumpy walked out of prison in 1963, 12 years later, the agreement was still standing. That meeting at the Stork Club became legend in organized crime circles. Not because of violence, not because of dramatic betrayals, but because two men from completely different worlds sat down and found a way to do business without destroying each other. Lucky Luciano would later tell his associates in Italy, in conversations that would be intercepted by Italian police years afterward, Bumpy Johnson was the smartest gangster I ever met in my life, and the most dangerous, because he didn't need me to respect him. He demanded it, and he got it. Bumpy never spoke publicly about that meeting. He was too smart for that. But people close to him said he kept that photograph of Anastasia in his office for the rest of his life. Not as a threat, as a reminder. A symbol of a truth that very few men in the criminal world ever come to understand. Real power isn't about who's willing to pull the trigger first. It's about who's smart enough not to have to. When Bumpy Johnson died of a heart attack in 1968, he was 62 years old. He died at Wells Restaurant in Harlem, the same restaurant where he'd held court for decades, playing cards with old friends, surrounded by his people, on his territory, undefeated to the end. The doctors said it was quick. One moment he was laughing at a joke, the next he was gone. Some say that's the only way a man like Bumpy could go. Not in a hail of bullets, not in a prison cell, but on his feet, in his kingdom, on his own terms. More than 1,000 people attended his funeral. Shopkeepers who remembered the day Bumpy saved their business with a quiet loan. Preachers who never asked where the money came from when he donated to rebuild their churches. Numbers runners who'd worked for him for 30 years and never once got stiffed. Mothers who'd seen their sons avoid prison because Bumpy hired the right lawyer. Children who'd grown up wearing shoes Bumpy had paid for, eating from grocery bags he'd delivered when their fathers couldn't find work. And though no Italian mobster officially appeared at the service, everyone in Harlem knew that anonymous flowers arrived from the 5 families. Massive wreaths of white roses and black ribbon, delivered by men in expensive suits who didn't give their names. One last gesture of respect for the only man who had told them no and lived to tell about it. Because that February night in 1946, in a room filled with America's most dangerous men, Bumpy Johnson had taught a lesson that organized crime would never forget. You can build an empire with fear. You can build an empire with violence. But if you want to build something that lasts, something that survives wars and prisons and betrayals, you need something more powerful than bullets. You need respect. And respect can't be bought, can't be stolen, can't be taken by force. It's earned. One smart decision at a time. One strategic move after another. Like a chess player who always thinks 5 moves ahead, who never shows his full hand, who understands that the best victory is the one where nobody has to die. That was the lesson of the Stork Club. That was the reason why when Lucky Luciano's bodyguards pointed their pistols at Bumpy Johnson, it was the most powerful mobster in the world who blinked first. Because he recognized something in the eyes of that quiet man from Harlem. He recognized an equal. And equals don't threaten each other. They negotiate.